Hello and welcome to the Haaretz Podcast. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer. The political landscape in the United States regarding Israel is in a state of flux. It's happening across political lines, on the right and the left, undergoing radical changes as a result of the Iran war, the ongoing effects of what has happened and continues to happen in Gaza. While Americans, Israelis, and the rest of the world all watch and wait to see if President Donald Trump ends up with a deal or a resumed war in Iran, the clock has begun to tick ahead of the U.S. midterms this coming November, which will finally measure the actual impact of all of this on American voters. Joining me to discuss the state of the Iran negotiations, what we've seen in the first primaries ahead of the midterms, and the races ahead is Haaretz Washington, D.C. correspondent Ben Samuels. Ben, welcome back to the podcast.
Great to be with you.
So we all remain mired in this eternal debate, seemingly endless, of will he or won't he? Agreement or war with Iran? It looks like President Trump is currently not interested in renewing a military conflict, even though it seems like it is pretty clear that things are not going his way in the negotiations with Iran. From the Beltway, where do things stand?
You know, the thing with all of these negotiations, like anyone that has covered, whether it is the Iran diplomatic affair or how it was with Gaza and how it has been with many of Trump's sort of like chess moves, if you want to even call it that, is that the imminence has always been more of a factor than the actual reality of the situation. So, you know, we've been hearing for weeks now that, you know, there's a 24-hour deadline only for Trump to extend the deadline by a few days or a few weeks or however long it may be. This past weekend, it seemed as if there was more sort of movement toward not a final status agreement, but a long-term extension that would clear the path toward continued final status negotiations that would potentially end the war. You know, Trump has already said a bunch that the war is effectively over and that what's happening now are negotiations for a sort of long-term strategic doctrine that would remove Iran as a nuclear power off the table. But what's really happening is that the goalposts are being shifted further and further and further with every passing day and every passing negotiation. And we're not talking about a sort of long-term peace agreement. We're talking about whether or not Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz or whether or not they would take away all the mines and what would happen with the highly enriched uranium. And this is all part and parcel of a bigger picture where so little was actually accomplished from the kinetic military campaign that the United States and Israel launched, that any sort of negotiation that Trump is trying to eventually spin as a win wouldn't actually be that much of a win. It would just be sort of moving the goalposts back where they were 2 or 3 times before he shifted the goalposts to where they currently stand.
There are reports that there's a tone of Trump punishing Netanyahu for getting him into this mess if he has to blame somebody that's not himself. Netanyahu is clearly the first candidate for doing so. And as a result, there's a lot of nervousness in the Israeli military establishment that Israel is being distanced from the negotiations and expressing concern that Israeli interests are not being taken into account. Is there a sense in Washington that Trump has soured on Netanyahu and blaming him for the debacle of where he stands in Iran right now?
There's definitely a tone of that, but, you know, I would really caution leaning too much into that because, you know, we've seen it happen so many times, especially this past administration where people have been saying this is the beginning of the long-awaited fallout between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. And it just never happens that way. If anything, Trump defies the odds and brings himself closer to Bibi. That being said, there is no doubt that Israel is effectively being sidelined with these current negotiations. You know, I think leading up to the war, it seemed as if like there was this real fork in the road moment between Trump and Bibi where either they were going to like go down swinging together or there was going to be a very real rupture in their relationship. Clearly, it went the one way. Now, Trump is designating Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to lead negotiations with states that Bibi considers inherently hostile, whether that is Qatar, whether that is Turkey, whether these are more complicated figures like Pakistan or Saudi Arabia that aren't necessarily just like out and out, quote unquote, enemies of the state. And by the state, I mean Bibi. But, it's very clear that kind of like how Gaza was, I hesitate to use the word resolved because, May 2026, we're not that resolved, but it did end a very specific chapter of hostilities. So, I think it's very clear that Bibi is not a central figure in Trump's efforts to wind down the war as it currently stands. But that doesn't mean that Trump is blaming Bibi explicitly for getting him into this mess or saying that Bibi's going to have to pay the price for whatever comes out of these diplomatic negotiations. In fact, right before I hopped on to record this podcast with you as of Monday morning, Donald Trump appears to be conditioning all the mediating countries to join the Abraham Accords and normalize ties with Israel in order for this deal to hold. So, whether or not Qatar and Pakistan normalize ties with Israel seem at face value, at the very least, than being as charitable as possible, it seems like that has very little to do with why Donald Trump launched this war in the first place, according to him, to make sure that Iran never has a nuclear weapon. But, again, the goalposts keep shifting because that is reality in Donald Trump's America and on planet Earth, where Donald Trump is head of the most important and strongest military power in history.
So, Ben, let's turn to where we think this will bring American voters in the midterm. Officially, midterm season is upon us. We've had some primaries. There are some campaigns that are really at their peak right now. So let's go through some of them and then talk about the overall impact that Israel, Iran, and the war has played in voters' minds right now. The real story that we've seen from, beginning, middle, and end is the Kentucky Republican primary. Can you talk us through what happened there?
Sure. So, I think this was the real litmus test for how the level of disenchantment from voters for Israel becoming an issue in local congressional districts that seemingly have nothing to do with Israel. Thomas Massie has long been a thorn in the side of the American Jewish establishment, from people with pro-Israel interest, from groups like AIPAC and the Republican Jewish Coalition, who, really want both parties to have an unabashed pro-Israel line. They've had a lot more success with Republicans over the past decade, but as listeners of this podcast are probably well aware, the dam has been breaking a little bit. Thomas Massie is the number one person, perhaps in either party, honestly, that is really trying to shake the status quo of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Pro-Israel groups and megadonors have wanted to take him down for many years, but because of the fracturing of his relationship with Donald Trump in recent months, whether that was due to Massie not wanting to vote for Trump's ambitious domestic spending agenda or leading the charge in releasing the Epstein files and, also while he was doing this, trafficking in pretty nefarious tropes about Israel and Jewish people, about, their level of power over the U.S. government and over Jeffrey Epstein as an alleged Mossad agent. This really led to a falling out between him and Trump. And this in turn led to the floodgates being opened, where pro-Israel organizations and megadonors made Massie's primary the most expensive single congressional primary in American political history. This comes after two previous Democratic primaries that became the most expensive primaries in American political history, all because pro-Israel organizations, and specifically AIPAC's United Democracy Project Super PAC, have spent tens of millions of dollars in this. So on one hand, Massie lost because his voters, or the voters in his district, really became sick of Massie shifting the agenda into something that wasn't about Donald Trump's agenda. And Republican voters have shown time and time again that they are in Trump's corner, no matter what polls may show, no matter what Twitter shows, no matter what Tucker Carlson may say. Voters are in Trump's corner. That is why Massie lost. On the other hand, it certainly didn't help Massie's cause that his race became the most expensive primary in history and that $30 million were spent overall, much of which, the majority of which, was spent from megadonors like Miriam Adelson and Paul Singer and the Republican Jewish Coalition, putting their largest financial independent expenditure in its history into the race. AIPAC's United Democracy Project, Christians United for Israel put money into it. So this was really, the pro-Israel establishment trying to consolidate its hold in the Republican Party and taking away any sort of dissent with how the status quo currently operates.
So this seems really good if you're worried about the deterioration of the status of Israel in the Republican Party, because what this shows for the Republicans and the strength of the Republican Party and the not necessarily strength of the whole Tucker Carlson, Candace Owen wing, but it could have repercussions in the general election, right?
Not only that, but it is causing generational long-term damage. So, they may have won the battle with Thomas Massie, but it's very clear that Thomas Massie isn't going anywhere. And the ideology and the agenda and the vision that Thomas Massie embodies is not going anywhere, especially with younger voters. And not only that, but also with voters on the progressive left flank that kind of found themselves to be weird ideological allies with this guy who is one of the, he is a card-carrying libertarian Republican. And you wouldn't think that he would be allied with potential 2028 Democratic presidential contenders like Ro Khanna, but that is the world that we're living in 2026. So AIPAC may have won the battle, but, I really would caution supporters of AIPAC and, AIPAC-aligned organizations and donors to really wonder about whether or not this strategy is causing more long-term harm than good. So in the general election in November for 2026, you're really going to see Israel and the influence of pro-Israel organizations doing outside spending. This is going to come up as an electoral issue in a way that it started to come up in the past few years, especially since AIPAC created its super PAC. But the scrutiny that's being placed on it right now and the level of attention being placed on it right now and the shifting winds in American political culture when it comes to Israel and when it comes to, outside spending, especially by special interest groups, it's going to start now. And it's only going to metastasize in future primaries and general elections and ahead of 2028 especially.
You wrote in Haaretz a really good analysis about it in which you said that the pro-Israel crowd was kind of feigning selective outrage at talk about how high the spending was in this race as playing into anti-Semitic tropes and Jewish money and power. But if you look at the facts, it was objectively the most expensive race in history, and it was fueled by these donors, the Adelsons and company, informed by concerns about Israel and anti-Semitism. And so pointing this out isn't necessarily bad faith or anti-Semitism. It's basically saying what happened, right?
Yeah, I think there is room for both of those things to hold true. I think they can certainly be manipulated and the frequency and the tone can be shifted a little bit to lean into one narrative over the other. But at the end of the day, they are both facts that this was the most expensive primary in American political history on the backs of pro-Israel spending. Thomas Massie has long been someone who has promoted conspiracy theories, and he is someone that has used his own critiques of Israel to give himself a national platform.
So, Ben, that's the big race that we've had results on so far. What other primary races have you watched in which the Israel-Iran Middle East has played a part, and what races are you watching right now?
So as far as primaries go, I think one important thing to flag is that there will be more progressive Democrats in the next Congress that are unabashed critics of Israel and advocates for Palestinian rights. So that happened in New Jersey with the victory of Annalila Mejia over Tom Malinowski, despite AIPAC, trying to spend to defeat Malinowski, but not realizing that it was elevating a progressive Democrat. Then in Texas, there is another progressive candidate. In Pennsylvania, another progressive candidate won his primary. In Illinois, AIPAC kind of had a mixed bag with trying to take down some progressives, but allowing the path for other progressives to take forward. The real next sort of magnifying glass will be a race this upcoming Tuesday, May 26th. There is a runoff in Texas. One of the candidates, Maureen Galindo, has repeatedly expressed anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, has said that American Zionists should be put in internment camps, just really kind of bonkers, so outside of the realm of appropriate, nuanced discourse. And she is one of two final candidates in a runoff for Texas Congressional District. And the Democratic Party has really tried to elevate her one competitor. Whether or not that's going to be successful, we'll see. But, across the board, whether it's Hakeem Jeffries, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the official congressional campaign arm of the Democratic Party, they are really sort of going all in to try to defeat Galindo. And it's important to note also that in this district, which kind of leans red, there is a super PAC with mysterious funding sources that has links to Republican fundraising arms that has tried to elevate Galindo, actually, because it is clear that she is so beyond the pale and that she is such a defeatable candidate in a general election that it would be better for Republicans for a crazy anti-Semite to run in the general. So it is really kind of the encapsulation of bad faith politics and how the Israel-Jewish angle can really be squeezed and sprinkled in a very yucky way, to put it very politely.
Is that the technical Washington, D.C. term? Yucky?
That is the PG version of the Haaretz Podcast version. But, for adult listeners, we can use more colorful language. But then beyond that, the Michigan Senate Democratic primary is the real kind of outstanding real battle where Israel, Gaza, Iran, Middle East at large is going to play a significant role, and where pro-Israel spending is likely to have a very significant role.
That will take place in August, right?
That will take place in August. And then in the general election, I think all eyes will be on Maine in a lot of ways to see if Graham Plattner, who is now basically the presumed Democratic nominee, whether or not his views and colorful background and real sort of unabashed progressive messaging is enough to elevate him to victory, but also whether it is motivating pro-Israel spending to make sure that Susan Collins defeats him in the Senate race and effectively in turn making sure Republicans still control the Senate. So Michigan Democratic primary, Maine general election, those are the two real biggies that we'll have our eye on for the rest of 2026.
I saw a really dramatic headline. Michigan Senate primary is a fight over the future of the Democratic Party. So can you just briefly tell us what's going on there?
On one hand, yeah. On the other hand, everyone should, take a sip of water a little bit. These are local primaries. As much as there's a temptation to extrapolate what happens in either a congressional district or an entire state to a national trend line, it is just the story of that one state. So, there are three real candidates. One, Haley Stevens, who long has been a favorite of AIPAC, and she is running against Mallory McMorrow, who has sort of occupied the center line and tried to sort of become the encapsulation of this new model of Democrat who is trying to see how far left they have to go in Israel without going fully in. Mm-hmm. So, kind of more than dipping a toe in, but, not doing a cannonball in the pool. Then there's Abdullah Sayed, who has been an unabashed progressive critic of Israel and the Gaza war and has made that kind of the central core tenet of his national profile that's kind of been rising. So there's a real concern amongst the Jewish establishment that Stevens and McMorrow might cancel each other out, and that would allow Abdul al-Sayed to sort of take victory. The Jewish Democratic Council of America, meanwhile, endorsed both Stevens and McMorrow and saying we would feel comfortable with Democrats in Michigan voting for either of these candidates, which, you know, doesn't do a lot to quell concerns that they may cancel each other out, but it is sending a message that don't vote for Abdul al-Sayed. But again, you know, because there is this almost yearning inside Democrats across the country to make certain races, you know, litmus tests and acid tests about where the Democratic Party stands, you know, progressive nationwide are really hoping for an al-Sayed primary victory. But again, you know, this is a very competitive race that both in the primary, but in the general election, where a Republican could very well win the seat. And if Democrats want to take back control of the Senate, they need this seat. And there's a real concern that Abdul al-Sayed will not be able to carry the state in a general election. But other progressives are saying he is exactly the kind of candidate that will need to carry the state in a general election. So it is going to be a moving target over the next few weeks and the next few months. And it's going to be really fascinating to see how Israel plays into this.
And how is the American Jewish community feeling, I guess, in terms of its institutions, the institutional leaders, and what we're seeing from potential voters, but also how they're looking at, you know, the way the political winds are blowing? Are candidates aware of these feelings, harnessing these feelings? Just a recent story that you reported was seeing Prime Minister Netanyahu's favorability at the lowest level among American Jews since 2009, 67% holding unfavorable views compared to 28%. And we've had some incidents recently with Israeli ambassador to the United States not exactly making friends in the American Jewish community.
Yeah, I mean, the headline would be that the vibes are terrible. And I think as much disagreement as there is, I think the one thing that everyone can agree on is that the vibes are off. And, you know, I think no one is happy with the political picture as it currently stands. It has long been a truism that American Jews don't actually vote with Israel as a primary motivating factor at the ballot box. You know, this has always like kind of been like the third, fourth tier of issues, and they care more about issues that motivate liberal Americans more, whether that is protecting democracy or affordability or climate change or what have you, all these like logline hot button issues. What you're really seeing now, though, is Israel and anti-Semitism have really catapulted into that first or second tier of issues that they care about. And not only that, but voters are really saying that, you know, it could potentially be a deal breaker for me if we have opposing views on Israel or how to properly combat anti-Semitism in a way that it really hasn't been a mitigating factor before, but now it very well could be. And with margins so paper thin, you know, that could really make a difference in a lot of key races and a lot of key swing states. What you're seeing with politicians now is that rather than trying to really spell out how they have support for Israel and their kishkiz and how, you know, they believe in the unshakable, unbreakable U.S.-Israel bond, and that is the first thing that needs to be said no matter what. What you're seeing now is the first thing that needs to be said is like a condemnation of special interest groups putting money into primaries and about how Bibi's far-right government is ruining the U.S.-Israel relationship and how Itamar Ben-Gvir is causing Israel irreparable harm on the world stage. And
you're talking about the Ben-Gvir video with him abusing the detainees of the Gaza flotilla.
That, but it's not isolated to that. You know, it is years and years and years of actions and rhetoric, both coming from Ben-Gvir and Smotrich specifically, but the sort of culture that they have encouraged to flourish in Israel and the West Bank. So you're really seeing military aid come into question in a way that it's never really been questioned by the mainstream of the party. And what you're seeing in turn is the Israeli government doubling down and trying to isolate the American Jewish community and pushing them away. And when you have Israeli ambassador to the United States, Yechiel Leiter, calling J Street the organization that probably embodies the center of the Democratic Party more than any other Israel-focused organization today, when he calls them a cancer within the Jewish community. Not only is that just such a tone-deaf misreading of the landscape as it exists today, but it just causes so much long-term damage to whatever the Israeli government is trying to achieve in terms of maintaining support in America. And then you have, Israeli ministers appointed by Netanyahu comparing Reform Jews to dogs and saying you're marrying dogs in your synagogues. And Netanyahu and the pro-Israel establishment and Leiter condemn her remarks, but Netanyahu is the one who appointed this minister in the first place. American Jews just are not that naive anymore to be like, okay, well, at least he condemned this one. The other one was bad, but at least he did the right thing in this situation. It's all part of a bigger picture now and a bigger puzzle that American Jews are able to see from a more mile-high level than perhaps, your ordinary American Jew was able to do before.
And those who might otherwise be engaged or worrying or caring about getting politically involved on behalf of Israel, they see what the current Israeli leadership thinks of them and their camp, and they're less likely to do anything or to care.
Absolutely. I mean, the polls have shown it over and over again that young voters, Jewish or non-Jewish, are becoming rapidly alienated by Israel and the Israeli government specifically, and specifically the far-right fringes of the Israeli government. So if you are an 18-year-old voting for the first time, you are voting with this being your only frame of reference. And on one hand, it is that is the face value thing that you're, kind of dealing with right now. But this is a generational harm that is being implemented in real time that is going to spill over in elections to come. It doesn't exist in a vacuum, but the foundation is being built.
Ben, it's not directly related to the primaries, but I can't let you go without asking you about the horseshoe moment that you reported on between none other than Hunter Biden and Candace Owens. I don't know how much of a political impact it's going to have directly, but it's certainly symbolic about where the far left and the far right are meeting these days.
Yeah, also known as the I watched this so you don't have to story. It is just absolutely bonkers that...
For those of us who couldn't bear to watch it, tell us what happened.
Candace Owens is one of the most prolific propagators of anti-Semitic propaganda on the far right. Hunter Biden, famously the son of Joe Biden, famously the boogeyman of the far right, who said Hunter Biden was the embodiment of corruption under the Biden family. Candace Owens repeatedly said Hunter Biden should be jailed, and Hunter Biden was pardoned in the last hours of Biden's presidency on, charges not related to his corruption technically, but still just really the embodiment of what Republicans said was just crony family politics. Now, in May 2026, these two people are allies. And these two people are talking about how Israel is effectively pulling the strings of the American political system and how Israeli intelligence agents, conspired to take Joe Biden down. And Candace Owens, used that as an opportunity to talk about how if a president gets out of line, they've been assassinated, referring to John F. Kennedy, which, in itself is a baseless conspiracy theory. As someone who lives and breathes this stuff and who covers it every day for a living, I understand how we got here, but that doesn't make it any less crazy that we're actually here. And it still manages to boggle my mind on a daily basis that this is the reality of our political moment. And this is where things have come to. And it also really makes me worried about where things may be going in the future. So I encourage people to read my article summary of the Hunter Candace episode. So 90 minutes of your life that can be used doing other things.
Well, Ben, we will continue to rely on you to watch the unwatchable and to cover both the sane and the delusional as it plays out in Washington. Happy that you're back with us and looking forward to the next time we speak. I'm sure between now and November, those will be very frequent visits. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Always a pleasure, Allison. Thank you.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz Podcast. Thanks to my guest, Ben Samuels, and producer and editor, Adi Shacham. If you like our podcast, if you want to keep listening to it and make sure you never miss an episode, don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a comment and a 5-star rating, and that way more people can find us. And to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe to and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.